Well, hi, District Church, and thanks for joining us as we continue our series on Exodus. Looking backwards from here, in the first week, we were introduced to the people of God and their desperate situation in the bondage of slavery. In the second week, Pastor Kevin introduced us to Moses, and then the following week, Pastor Aaron really spoke about Moses' calling in his encounter with God at the burning bush. And today, we're continuing in that encounter, and we're focusing especially on chapter 4. And what we see in chapter 4 is these two streams that come to be tied together. We see the formation of the people of God and the formation of the leader of that people are intertwined. And Exodus is really about both. And chapter 4 is central to these two themes coming together. We see, for example, Moses has a pivotal moment in his life and calling as his leader. And we also see the people of God start to come on board with this too. The end of the chapter finishes with Moses meeting with the elders and the two of them going forth from there. So we have both the formation of the people and the leader tied together, and they go hand in hand. Some of the themes that we see here in this chapter are belief in God and trusting in Him, seeing God's power at work in your life, being used by God, knowing who He is, and then ultimately dwelling with God, the fact that God is with us. All of these themes we see here just in chapter 4. And the key to all of them we'll also see in this chapter. And that key is humility. Numbers 12:3 will tell us that Moses was the most humble man on the face of the earth. And that humility, I think, is what was key to Moses being able to be used so powerfully by God. For Moses being able to really experience the power of God in his life and to really dwell with God. If you want these same things, if you want to be able to dwell with God, which is really what this overall series is focused on, it really comes down to humility. St. Augustine said, "If you should ask me, what are the ways of God, I would tell you that the first is humility, the second is humility, and the third is still humility. Not that there are no other precepts to give, but if humility does not precede all that we do, our efforts are fruitless." Or you could look at Thomas Kempis in The Imitation of Christ. He says, "It is the humble man whom God protects and liberates. It is the humble whom He loves and consoles. To the humble He turns, and upon them bestows great grace. He reveals His secret to the humble, and with kind invitation bids them come to Him." Or take St. Elizabeth Ann Seton. "The gate of heaven is very low. Only the humble can enter it." Or we have Jesus Himself, beginning the Sermon on the Mount and Beatitudes, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Humility is the key to the spiritual life. And it's not even just the spiritual life that humility is so important for. Even in the business world, we see the leadership expert Jim Collins commenting on this. He, in his book, Good to Great, he's studying how companies really become the very best of the very best. And listen to what he says. He says, of the 1,435 companies that appeared on the Fortune 500 in our initial candidate list, only 11 made the very tough cut into our study, where he would call them great, truly great companies. And he says, in those 11, all of them had level 5 leadership in the key positions, including the CEO, at the pivotal time of transition. A level 5 leader was essential for a company moving from good to truly being great. And look at how he defines a level 5 leader. He says a level 5 leader is an individual who blends extreme personal humility with intense professional will. Moses was a level 5 leader. Again, he was the most humble man on the earth, despite doing amazing things. And what we find here is that this wasn't always the case. What really turned Moses into that leader, what really allowed him to start to be able to experience God, to dwell with God, to see God at work in his life, to be used by God, occurs right here in this encounter at the burning bush. And that pivotal point for Moses as the leader, and then also for the nation as a result, occurs here in chapter 4. So what we're going to talk about today is humility. We're going to talk first about what it looks like, and then second, how to get it. So first, what does humility look like? Now, there's many ways to define humility, but the definition I want us to use for right now is just this. Humility is simply alignment with reality. Humility is alignment with reality. It's seeing clearly. It's embracing truth. And what we find when we first encounter Moses is that he's actually not aligned with reality. When you are misaligned with reality, when you don't see clearly, you will tend to overvalue yourself, and you also tend to undervalue others. And we see this in Moses. In order to see this, we have to flip back to chapter 2. And Pastor Kevin spoke briefly about this. We're going to read this excerpt here. And this is significant because this is the first time in the story that Moses himself is acting and speaking. And so we'll pick it up in Exodus 2:11. It says, "One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, 'Why do you strike your companion?' He answered, 'Who made you a prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?' Then Moses was afraid and thought, 'Surely this thing is known.' When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian." See, Moses here is misaligned with reality. He is not seeing clearly. He's overvaluing himself. See, when you overvalue yourself, you tend to overvalue your own abilities. You tend to insert yourself. You tend to do it by yourself. You're over-reliant on yourself. And when we see that with Moses, we see that he is over-reliant on his own abilities. He just assumes that he can step in and that he can be the one to deliver his people out of Egypt on his own. He doesn't ask for any help. He just acts. And and related to that, he inserts himself into the situation. He sees an injustice, an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and he assumes that he has to be the one to intervene and do something about it. And so he just inserts himself right in. He does it his own way. He does it by himself. Again, note the difference when we get to chapter 4, that when God leads Moses and Moses delivers with God, that he first goes to all the elders of the people. Before he considers doing anything else, he brings others in. Here, Moses does it on his own. He just jumps right in. He doesn't ask anyone. He just leans in and inserts himself because, again, he's so confident in his own abilities to be able to do something about it. And he's therefore over-reliant as well on his own instincts, his own judgment, his own timing. Pastor Kevin mentioned when he spoke on this that one of the issues is that Moses' timing was completely off from God's timing. He just jumped right in and thought this is a moment that something had to be done. He trusted his own instinct to address the situation, but also to address it in response to his own rage and his own feeling. So when you are misaligned, when you're not humble, you tend to overvalue yourself, your own judgments, your own capabilities, all of the above. The other thing that happens when you're not humble is that you tend to undervalue others. You view them as obstacles. When he looked at the Egyptian, all he saw was an oppressor. All he saw was an obstacle to his own people. He didn't see the whole dignity of the person. He just eliminated him. He killed him and hid him in the sand. He viewed someone else as an obstacle. And he also viewed even his own people as less than. He undervalued them. He just assumed that he had to be the one to rule over them. And he inserts himself over them. And you can see that his own brothers were really offended by this. Who made you judge over us? Who do you think you are to just lord it over us like this? You can see that Moses undervalued even his own brothers in the situation because he was overvaluing himself. And the result is that God couldn't use him. The call never changes throughout Moses' entire life. He grew up probably knowing that there was something significant about his role. When we get to this point, you see he clearly senses a call to deliver his people. And later, when we get to chapter 4, it's the same call. But look what happens at this point. Moses ends up murdering someone. He ends up alienating his own people. and he has to run because now Pharaoh is incensed. It's a total disaster. When Moses tries to do it by himself, it ends in total failure. And how does God deal with Moses in this? The point is, God doesn't actually say anything directly, does he? And the reality is, if you are not humble, if you really aren't seeing clearly and you're overvaluing yourself, it's probably not going to matter what anyone else tells you. Just think of probably earlier in your life when you were a teenager, for example. You tended to think that your opinion was always right? That you know what's best. It doesn't matter what your parents are going to tell you. The fact is, when we are in this position, we're not really open to other people's input. And so we have to be shown. We have to God has to allow things to play out. We need to be shown who we really are because we can't see it when we're not seeing clearly. And so how does God do this? He lets Moses do what Moses does. He lets Moses fail spectacularly. And we see in that moment of failure that Moses loses everything. Remember, his whole career, his whole life, his purpose had been moving towards this moment. He saw himself almost surely as a deliverer of his people. And this is the moment when he acts. And then in one instance, all of that is gone. In the blink of an eye, his entire career is lost. Now he has no future. He flees to the desert to be a shepherd. His whole career is gone. Not only his career, his family is gone. Because he has to flee. He has to leave Egypt to save his life. Because Pharaoh was after him. And so in that one moment of failure, he loses everything. His career, his purpose, his identity, and even his family. And then after that failure, he spends 40 years in the desert. 40 years. Instead of being the deliverer of his people, instead of being a prince of Egypt, he's now just a wanderer and a foreigner with no place. And he is sitting there for 40 years, really not doing much, just shepherding, which you have a lot of time on your hands when you do that. And essentially then, that means he has 40 years to just look back and relive that failure over and over and over. And there's no change on the horizon. When he leaves all of that behind permanently, as far as he can tell. Nothing indicates that there will ever be anything at all different. And you would think that all of that, this flee into the desert, is actually moving him away from his calling. But the reality is, it's actually moving him towards it. This is God's way of moving him to become the leader that he needs to be. As Pastor Aaron shared last week, God needs him to become a servant before he can truly become the leader that he's meant to be. God needs to address his pride and lead him towards humility before he's able to really be used by God. And that, having looked at that, we're now ready to address our passage. And what we find here, when we meet Moses again at the burning bush, we see that it's completely different. When God says to him in chapter 3, I am sending you. You are going to be the one to deliver your people out of Egypt. I'm sending you to Pharaoh. We see that instead of just inserting himself like before, Moses now steps back. He's hesitant. He doesn't jump right in. He has a discussion with God about it. And we see that he's actually in some ways flipped. Now, instead of overvaluing himself, it seems to be overvaluing others. What does he say to God at the end of chapter 4, or in the middle of chapter 4? He says, Lord, please send someone else. Don't send me. Please send someone else. They can, we assume he's saying they can do it better than I can. I can't do this, God. Send somebody else. He's overvaluing others, thinking that they're more capable than he is. And he's undervaluing now himself. He is so focused on his own flaws. He says to God, the elders aren't going to believe me. This is at the beginning of chapter 4. Moses answered God, but behold, the elders will not believe me or listen to my voice. For they will say, the Lord did not appear to you. Why would the elders believe me, Lord? I'm a nobody. I've been a shepherd in the desert for 40 years. And if they've heard of me before, what they'd really be able to connect with me is that I'm a murderer, that I tried to lord it over my own people, that I failed miserably. he has been able to meditate on that failure for 40 years. And so now at the moment God is calling him, he's focused on that, his own flaws. The elders won't believe me. I'm a nobody. And more than that, God, I'm a stutterer. I have a speech impediment. Or in Moses' words, he says, I am slow of speech, Lord. I am slow of tongue. I'm not the guy you want, God. I stutter. I've been slow of speech in the past, it says. I've been slow of speech yesterday. I'm still slow of speech even after you've spoken to me, God. And that just tells us that Moses is deeply fixed on his own person, that this is something that he struggled with his whole life, and he's very sensitive to it. He just has this deep awareness of his own failure, his own limits, his own flaws. And so when we meet Moses here in chapter 4, he's a very different person than he was back in chapter 2. And the truth is that the world will do this to you. Just live long enough, and you'll be reduced in this way. Right? Life has a way of catching up with us. Life has a way of humbling us. Moses' failure, his time dwelling in obscurity in the desert, have really brought him down. Instead of overvaluing himself and undervaluing others, he's now in some sense overvaluing others and undervaluing himself. And this is really the plight of every human being. We all tend to either be overconfident, we overvalue ourselves at the expense of others, or we tend to be underconfident. Now we overvalue others and we undervalue ourselves. And we can oscillate between one or the other. We keep going back and forth, and it really just depends on our circumstances. For myself, I can say that this is very true. Back when I was in college, I used to really prize my intelligence. You tend to prize what you're praised about most, right? And if you get good grades or people comment on that, you just tend to internalize it. And I remember my senior year of college when I was interviewing for jobs, I remember one particular interview I had with it was actually a defense firm that made helicopters. And in the interview, I remember them asking me about my classes, my grades, and just different situations if I'd be thrown into. And I just remember being so confident, saying that, yeah, I know that if I just apply myself, I can easily get an A. If I just work hard enough, I know I can do anything. And I was at the top of my class in engineering. I had a very good GPA. And I didn't think anything of it. I just was very full of my own abilities. And I remember being shocked when I heard a few days later from a friend who actually knew the people who were doing the interview, that the interviewers had said, yeah, we had this one guy we talked to. We really liked him. He seemed very capable, but he was just so arrogant that we couldn't make him an offer. And I just felt in my spirit, I wasn't even a Christian then, but I felt in my spirit, I'm like, oh, they're talking about me. And it was the first time it hit me how much I was overvaluing myself and thinking how much better I was than others and how capable I was. Now, fast forward a few years to coming to DC. And I mean, I've realized that I knew it before DC, but I've especially realized that since then that I was just a big fish in a very small pond. And I come here and there's people here that just blow me out of the water intellectually. I can't keep up. I am not quick-witted. I don't have the memory. I don't have the ability to think at that level. And actually now, when I look at my own intelligence, it actually is a source of weakness for me. My memory is failing, especially since having kids, but it's failing all the time. I feel very slow-witted most of the time. I just don't, I know for a fact that I am not intelligent compared to the majority of you who are in our congregation. I see how much God has gifted others. And so what tends to happen to me now is I very much overvalue other people and I really undervalue myself. And when God calls me to step into situations, even preaching or teaching or things like that, I'm always aware of how little I know and I'm afraid of being exposed. And so I have flip-flopped, and now my default is to think so little of myself that it's hard for me to engage. And the reality is, whether you are overvaluing yourself or undervaluing yourself, neither of these things is actually humility. When we get to Exodus 4 and Exodus 3, when Moses encounters God at the burning bush, we do definitely see progress. Moses is not the prideful person he was in chapter 2. Look at how he encounters God. As Pastor Aaron mentioned, when God calls to him from the burning bush, the first thing Moses says is, "Here I am, Lord. Hineni. I'm here. I'm available." Right? He is open to God. He's not as prideful. As we mentioned, he doesn't jump right in and assume that he's the guy for the job. If anything, he's trying to argue God out of it. But this still isn't actually humility. When he says, "God, who am I?" When he says, "God, who are you?" "Well, the elders won't believe me. Lord, I can't speak well. Send somebody else." It would seem that he really has made strides, and he has. He has moved towards being more humble. But he's still not there yet. He still doesn't see things exactly as they are. He's misaligned. See, the reality is, even at this point, God still cannot use Moses. God couldn't use him in chapter 2 because he overvalued himself. God can't use him here in chapter 4 because he's undervaluing himself. God is telling him, "Moses, go, I'm sending you." And Moses is saying, "No, send somebody else. You can't use me, Lord. I'm too flawed." God can't use him in either situation. God can't fully dwell, and Moses dwell in his presence. God can't show him his power, his signs. God can't really just use him to be involved with him, because Moses still isn't at that place of humility yet. See, the reality is, whether you overvalue yourself or you undervalue yourself, in both instances, you are still focused on yourself. It's very clear in Exodus 2 how Moses is focused on himself. It's a little bit less clear when we get here to Exodus 3 and Exodus 4. But I want you to notice this. God and Moses have this dialogue that starts in chapter 3 and continues through chapter 4. Moses has 5 different objections that he puts before God. And 4 out of these 5 objections center on him, on Moses. The first thing Moses says when God tells him that God is going to send him to Pharaoh, Moses says, "Who am I?" Note the I. Who am I? Then Moses says, "Who are you, God?" But then he goes immediately back to himself. "The elders will not believe me. They will not listen to my voice." The next one, "I am not eloquent. I am slow of speech." Then he finally says, "Send someone else." And in parentheses, we can read Moses saying, "Don't send me. Don't send me. Send somebody other than me." And so in 4 of these 5 objections that Moses is bringing to God, he's focused on himself. It's really him that he's paying attention to. We even see that subtly in the fact that Moses' very first objection is not, "Who are you, God? Who are you that the elders are going to believe or that this is going to happen?" That's what he says second. The very first thing he says is, "Who am I?" And that is the condition that he's in. His focus is all on himself. And see, the reality is, on the one hand, it appears that he overvalues others and he undervalues himself. But the truth is, he actually still overvalues himself. Look at this. He's over-reliant on his own instincts, his own feelings, his own judgments, just like he was back in chapter 2. God tells Moses in Exodus 3:10, "I am sending you, Moses." And Moses says, "No, send somebody else. I'm not the right person, God." God tells Moses in Exodus 3:18, "The elders will believe you." But Moses replies back in Exodus 4, the beginning of Exodus 4, "No, they won't, God. The elders are not going to listen to me or believe me." Moses is trusting his own judgment rather than what God is telling him. Moses is also overemphasizing his role. We already talked about how 4 of his 5 objections are focused on himself and what he's going to be doing. He ignores the fact that in Exodus 3:12, God is saying, "I will be with you." See, Moses is still overvaluing his own judgment, his own instinct, his own feelings, and he's undervaluing others because clearly he's undervaluing what God is saying. He thinks little of what God is saying and much more about what he feels. He's still not seeing things as they are. He's not seeing clearly. He's undervaluing himself in one sense, but overvaluing in another. Listen to what Tim Keller says. Keller's talking about a quote by C.S. Lewis, and he says this: C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity makes a brilliant observation about gospel humility at the very end of his chapter on pride. "If we were to meet a truly humble person," Lewis says, "we would never come away from meeting them thinking that they were humble. They would always be telling us that they would not always be telling us that they were a nobody. because a person who keeps saying that they are a nobody is actually a self-obsessed person. No, the thing that we would remember from meeting a truly gospel, humble person is how much they seem to be totally interested in us. Because the essence of gospel humility is not thinking more of myself or thinking less of myself. It is thinking of myself less. Now, you might come back at me and say, well, maybe, but really what's really driving Moses here is he's just afraid. He doesn't want to go do it because he's terrified. And that is true. Think of what God has called him to do. He has said, Moses, you, this nobody shepherd, are going to go to the world's superpower, the king of the world's superpower, and you are going to tell him that you need to take away his most valuable economic asset. Because the slaves, the people of Israel, were what drove Pharaoh's economy. God is saying, I'm sending you to go address the world's superpower and take away the foundation of their economy. That is terrifying to consider, especially when Pharaoh held the power of life and death. So fear is definitely at play here in this interaction between Moses and God. But that's actually precisely the point, because the fear has a way of focusing on where Moses' true confidence lies. The fear helps Moses to see where his true focus is. See, when you are called to something that is huge like this, there's something that you feel is outside of your abilities, it will show you where you truly believe your ability comes from. We see when Moses is confronted with this major calling that his eyes are really on himself. They're not on God. God still cannot use him as a result. He's still not humble enough. He still doesn't see clearly. He's still misaligned with reality. Because when you really are aligned with reality, you're embracing the truth. And the truth is that you actually are limited. Moses is starting to understand that by chapter 4. He gets that part. But what he doesn't yet understand is that God is unlimited. God is everything. You might be limited, you might be frail, you might be weak, you might be a failure, you might be a nobody. But God is the opposite of all of those things. God is everything. And God promises to be with you. God loves you, and God promises to be with you. And you need to have that complete picture of the truth to be truly aligned with it. See, Moses didn't understand the significance of the burning bush. The bush on its own, just an ordinary bush, nothing impressive about it. Even fire on its own, more impressive. But what really makes a burning bush impressive is this ordinary, insignificant bush that is burning, that it is filled with fire, and yet is not consumed. What truly is impressive is that strength that is present in that weakness. That is what makes a servant of God truly effective. And it's only a humble servant of God that's able to see both sides of this. So how do you get humility then? If humility is what's required to really dwell with God, to be able to use by God, how do we get it? We see that life does have a way of teaching it, our failures and the events of our life. It does lead us towards humility, but it's not enough, because it can just leave us at a dead end and undervaluing ourselves in that sense we talked about. What Moses needs to overcome his lack of humility, his false humility here, are signs. And we see that this happens. We have first the sign, we have the burning bush, but really the signs that start to change Moses' mind are the staff. When he throws it down, it becomes a snake and he picks it back up. And then the second sign, which is when he sticks his hand inside of his cloak, comes out leprous, white, sticks it back in, and it comes out healed. These signs are what allow Moses to make that shift into true humility. And signs are, as they would suggest, they're just focal points. They give you a place to put your eyes, to change your focus from yourself to something else. And the signs, of course, point to something else. They point to God. The signs are what cause Moses to believe. The signs are what Moses does for the elders, and that causes them to believe and worship at the end of the chapter. And ultimately, the signs are what causes Egypt to believe. Even though Egypt will not worship, they still believe who God is after all the signs, the plagues that Moses does. And we'll talk about that in the coming weeks. See, this is the turning point. It's these signs that start to shift Moses's perception, where he starts to see more clearly. And the true turning point we see for Moses, and the true turning point then that will follow for the people of God, is really here at Exodus 4:20. And we see in Exodus 4:20, it says this: Moses took his wife and his sons and had them ride on a donkey, and he went back to the land of Egypt. See, first of all, true humility is always expressed in obedience. True humility is always expressed in obedience to God. And we see that that is what Moses is finally doing. He's no longer resisting God. He's no longer fighting. He's obeying. He finally gets it. And here's the kicker that I want you to realize. Right after it says that, it says this: and when he went back to Egypt, it says, and Moses took the staff of God in his hand. Now, this is a pretty minor detail, right? He takes the staff of God in his hand, of course. But we have to realize that when Moses came into this encounter with God, it was his staff. He leaves the encounter with it being called the staff of God. When God's talking with Moses, he says, what is that in your hand? Moses says, a staff. It's his own staff. But something has shifted where now the staff is no longer his. It is the staff of God. Now, we have to understand that in that culture, a staff was used, like a walking stick. It was used for support when you're walking, just like we use walking sticks today, but it was also much more than that. A staff was also a weapon that you could use to fend off others, and especially for Moses as a shepherd, he would use that staff to fend off predators from the sheep. But a staff was even more than that in that culture. A staff was a source of identity. A staff was what you could use as a pledge of your identity. It's kind of like a driver's license today. Your staff identified who you were. And Moses, as we do with our own driver's license today, Moses carried his staff with him wherever he went. And so the fact that this had changed into the staff of God would remind him, no matter where he was, he would have it in his hand to look down. And he could see in his staff the true picture we've been talking about, the complete picture, the alignment with reality that humility is. The staff would remind him of his time that he was a shepherd. All those years he carried it in the desert. And it would remind him that he is, on his own, a failure, that he couldn't do it. At the same time, the staff would remind him also of God's power. He would be reminded that the staff had turned into a snake, and then when he picked it up again, that it turned back into a staff. And he would use that staff for essentially all of the plagues. In parting the Red Sea even, it would be done through the staff. And the staff would therefore remind him of his own inability, because it would remind him of his failure, and it would remind him that it was God's power at work, that he couldn't do this on his own. But at the same time, it would remind him that God is with him, that God was for him, that God had called him and equipped him and sent him. That staff was what allowed him to see clearly, because now he wouldn't overvalue himself. He was reminded of his failure. And he wouldn't undervalue himself, because he was reminded that God had called him and that God was with him and for him. The staff was key. But we don't carry a staff today. So where does that leave us? How do we actually get humility? And the answer is found in the New Testament with another mention of a staff. See, in Matthew 27:39-31, it says this about Jesus. It says, then they twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. These are the Roman soldiers right before he's crucified. It says they put a staff in his right hand, and then they knelt in front of him and mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews. And they spit on him and took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. And after they had mocked him, they took off the robe, put on his own clothes, and then they led him away to crucify him. Instead of being given a staff to reassure him, Jesus was handed a staff to beat him down. And after that, he was, in a sense, lifted up on a different staff. See, the staff that I'm talking about is, of course, the cross. And just as Moses' staff was his weapon to fight off enemies, the cross was Christ's way of defeating all the principalities and powers. And just as the staff of Moses expressed his identity, so also the cross of Christ expresses his true identity. If you want to know who God truly is, what he's truly like, look no further than the cross. And just like Moses, that staff, that cross, eventually becomes in our hands the staff of God. What you have to recognize is that staff is ours to hold on to. And it is what allows us to be humble. Because when we hold on to that, when we hold on to the cross, it helps us to neither overvalue ourselves or undervalue ourselves. Because the cross reminds us of who we really are. That left by ourselves, we are nothing. We are failures. We are actually rebelling against God. We are in need of His mercy and grace. We are nothing. At the same time, it reminds us, though, of how much we are loved. That God truly is for us. That He loves us, that He is with us, that He will never forsake us. And both of these things, just like Moses' staff told him both of those things anytime he looked at it, so also the cross is what tells us that. And that's how we're able to truly see clearly, to be in alignment with reality. Both of these things are essential. Now, the thing about this, though, is that you need faith to grab hold of it. When Moses' staff was turned into a snake, God said, "Throw down your staff," and it turned into a snake, and Moses ran away. Moses only really saw the power of the miracle when he obeyed God's command to go back and pick it up. And it's when he picked it up and the snake turned back into his staff, that's when it really started to click for Moses. And the same is true for us. We can't run away from the cross. We also have to grab hold of it. You have to reach out by faith and really take in the fact that this is what the cross means for you. That you really truly are loved, and at the same time that you are in need of salvation. The more that you grab hold of that staff, the more that you hold on to that and take it everywhere you go, the more that you will become like Moses, truly humble, aligned with reality and seeing things as they are, embracing truth, and the more that God will truly be able to dwell with you and use you.
Thank you so much for joining us for District Church Online. We would love to hear from you so that we can pray for you, connect you to our community life through one of our life groups in Northern Virginia, Maryland, or DC, or give you more information about our in-person Sunday morning services in Columbia Heights in DC. Also, if you haven't subscribed yet and turned on notifications, we encourage you to do so right now so you don't miss a beat with what's going on online with the District Church. Now, may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all forever. Amen.